Hi, everybody. Welcome to this SEG webinar organized by the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Committee, hosted online. In case you haven't managed to dial in, there's two options for accessing the webinar audio. Hopefully you are already able to hear us and see us. Why that's not working. So we are going to be taking questions from the audience throughout the panel discussion. If you'd like to submit a question, you should be able to see a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and please just put that up there. Otherwise, logistical questions, please put into the chat and they will be answered if necessary. So that's a little bit of administration. A quick note on the Society of Economic Geologists, for those of you who might not be familiar. The Society of Economic Geologists was founded in 1920, and the intention of the society is that it's dedicated to advancing the science, discovery and responsible development of mineral resources. You can find out more at segweb.org, including how to sign up as a member if you aren't already. I would like to take a moment before we begin this webinar to acknowledge Brian Hole, who passed away recently. Brian was the executive director of SEG for 23 years, starting in 2000. This is the first event that SEG is holding since his passing. He was incredibly dedicated to the society, both professionally and personally. And it's appropriate that this is actually our first event, because one of the last major initiatives that Brian supported within the SEG was the formation of this DE&I committee as a standing committee within the society, reflecting the importance that this plays in our society as a whole. So just take a second to acknowledge Brian and his contributions. Right, so in case you weren't sure where you were today, this is a panel discussion related to the Picture of Scientist film, Picture of Scientist film. Hopefully all of you signing in today have had the opportunity to watch it for a first or second time. This is the second time the SEG is hosting a screening of this film. The first time was a few years back, and there was a panel discussion following that. It provided a lot of valuable insights and discussion, and the DE&I committee thought it would be incredibly valuable to host a screening again and have another panel discussion, and that is what we're here to do today. As an introduction, if anybody is wondering, my name is Libby Sharman. I am the technical lead for BHP Explore. I'm also an SEG counselor starting this year, and I will be moderating the panel discussion today. I'm now going to sort of take you through an introduction of the panelists. We'll have the discussion, we'll do an audience Q&A at the end. But first, what I'd like to do is we've got a brief poll we'd like everybody to participate in, and we're going to trigger that now. And if you could participate in that as I'm introducing the panelists and they're introducing themselves, that would be fantastic. So hopefully you will now be seeing that poll. Yeah. So that's fantastic. We have three amazing panelists who have agreed to join us today. I will let them introduce themselves in more detail, but just quickly, we have Sarah Gordon from Satala, Neil Fernandez from Tech, and Lara McClintock from South 32. If you could go ahead and introduce yourselves in that order, please.
Hello, everybody. My name's Dr. Sarah Gordon. And as Libby just said, I'm CEO and co-founder of Sotala, which is a risk management and sustainability consultancy that specializes very much in the mining sector. But we also get to play with other organizations as well that got nothing to do with mining. In my spare time, I also help to run a little not-for-profit called Responsible Raw Materials, and also advise the likes of the UK government on their critical minerals strategy, etc. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know if I can follow such a concise introduction, but my name is Neil Fernandez. I'm a project technical specialist with Tech Resources. And I currently work on a number of our North American exploration programs. I've spent a bunch of time in South America working in exploration, currently I'm in charge of our technical training and for our exploration programs at Red Dog. I've spent a lot of time working in and out of the SEG while I was a student, and looking forward to being part of this panel to talk about such an important topic.
Great, and hello everyone. My name is Laura McClintock. I'm an exploration geologist, and my current role is technical manager for greenfields exploration for North America for South 32. I've mostly worked in North America across a number of different commodity types. And in my spare time, I volunteer my time with Women Geoscientists of Canada. It's a nonprofit group that focuses on equity, inclusion, and diversity in Canada in the field of geosciences. And I'm based out of Vancouver. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you all. I'm gonna now stop sharing my screen so we can see our lovely panelists' faces for the remainder of the conversation. So I want to thank you all again for being able to participate in this. And I wanted to start out with asking our panelists what their main takeaways were from viewing this documentary, and particularly if it's that they viewed it for a second time to prepare for this event, how your takeaways differed from the first time that you viewed it. And Laura, would you like to kick us off with that conversation?
Sure, I definitely can. So I guess some of the takeaways I can start with my experience the first time I saw it, which was about 2 years ago in 2021. It was probably a very emotional kind of experience to see this, you know, on the screen and have such vulnerable, you know, experience shared by, you know, prominent women in sciences, and to almost relate to those. You know, I think I received a lot of flashbacks internally about examples or very similar situations I experienced in my early to mid-career that were along the same lines of bullying and harassment. And it was a very kind of emotional ride to revisit those again. And viewing it the second time, you know, kind of seeing a new lens on the film was, well, what can we do? What is the shift and the change we can do as individuals, as organizations, as companies to start put things into action? What is our path forward? What are some key steps that we need to address to kind of see the momentum that not only since this film, but the last 2 years really take hold on the industry, and what can we do? And some of the other something that I also kind of reflected for myself was, you know, I myself am a biracial, you know, person. My father's Caucasian, my mother's Asian, and there's a bit of that, not only gender bias, but, you know, ethnic bias that can happen and experience that. And the film touches on it, and I think there's more we can do to talk through some of these, you know, important barriers or challenges, both the other marginalized groups within our industry, not only kind of gender, but you know, race and LGBTQ. You know, we can start to have more of those conversations and integrate those into our discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, would you want to expand on that?
Yeah, sure. I was hoping you weren't going to say, would you contradict any of that? Because I certainly wouldn't. Yeah, I think that the first time that I watched it, I would totally agree, Lara, with what you said. The first time was really quite emotional. And also as well, so my background originally as a geologist, so my PhD is in the composition of meteorites, which of course is so great when it comes to economic geology. But of course, one of the storylines that's followed in the documentary is very much around fieldwork with regards to meteorites. And when I was a PhD student, I really wanted to go to Antarctica, but actually I was kind of warned off it because of actually the storyline that you see in the film. And so the film was like, okay, now I understand more about that. And a lot of those, those quiet discussions where people take you to one side and just say, look, you can go, but just be aware that there's a bit of a cultural thing here that we need to get fixed, or it's not quite right. So the first time round, I think it was more of a, now I understand a little bit more about that. And yeah, quite emotional, but also a thing of saying, well, what can I do? What can we do to help address all of this? Which then takes me into the second time watching it, where you think, okay, well, actually, the world's a very different place in 2023 compared to 2020. It's not just COVID, but also we've had some pretty epic reports that have been published about some of these aspects within our sector. And so I think actually, if nothing else, there's a lot more awareness compared to in 2020. In some areas, a lot more transparency about it, and also a lot more accountability. And I think that the accountability comes down to us as individuals, because every single one of us is a leader in this sector. It's not just the CEOs and everybody else. Every single one of us is a leader. And we all bring our own diverse thoughts to the discussions. And I think that one thing that I learned from the film was, everybody has their own perspective. And actually, one of the scariest things is working out how you can seek out perspectives that you don't necessarily agree with. Because that's what you need to find, or ones that you are uncomfortable with or scared of asking because you don't necessarily know how to ask for those areas. And I think that one of those big changes we've seen since 2020 as well, which actually maybe goes in the wrong direction, is people are sometimes scared to talk about some of this stuff because they're worried about offending other people. So I think that was almost, it's very, very different takeaway the second time around, because there are certain aspects of diversity which are so politically charged. Sometimes it's quite difficult to find the right language to have those conversations without inadvertently offending somebody. But we've got to go through being offensive in a way in order to be able to understand those perspectives. So hopefully that builds a little bit on Lara's fantastic beginning. Yeah,
Neil, does that resonate with you and your experience of viewing the film?
Totally. And to be clear, this was my first time viewing the film. And not to repeat what Sarah and Lara have already talked about, because I agree with those 2 points of view entirely. I think it's quite interesting for me because both my MSc and my PhD supervisors were women. And in geosciences, especially in economic geology, I recognize now more and more that how rare that might be in my case. And it makes me think about the dynamics that we have within both society and in economic geology as a whole, and how things have evolved. And I think it's also is like it never rings true. It was like, if you can see a person like that, you can believe that they can exist in our industry, in our academia, and so on and so forth. And I also think about, what made me think about like what I've seen and what they must have experienced to advance to those positions as well. Like women in academia, as we know, as the film highlights, really have to really fight to carve out their niche. And sometimes that niche is given to them is smaller in terms of the lab sizes that they're actually given compared to their male coworkers. And they actually have to show statistics that to combat that. Oh, no, it's not like that. But yes, in fact, it is. And I think about people on this panel. I think about people that I work with. I work with a lot of talented people from all sorts of backgrounds that both Sarah and Lara have talked about. And I wonder what life and work would be like without them if they had been pushed out of the industry. And I think importantly for me, the Jane Willenbring, I guess, who was working in Antarctica, her experience with her own male colleague and his perception of what was going on and what was not going on is just such a, it's important to always have an ally and to be able to talk to and to be that person that, to reach out to. And I feel like it made me reflect on times in my career where I've been an ally and times when I haven't. And it's certainly, yeah, it's been very, very impactful for me.
Yeah, so I mean, that's fantastic. And a couple of you touched on some of these actions. You talked about being allies, you've talked about some reports. Would any of you like to sort of dive in and talk about experiences either in organizations that you're working with or that you've seen that are being taken in geosciences to address the concerns raised in the film and the experiences of minorities? Sarah?
Yes. Sorry, Libby. We're all being too polite with one another now, aren't we? That's the problem. Next time we're all going to speak at the same time, I guarantee you. So one of the other hats I wear. So sorry, it's freezing where I'm at the moment. So I've decided to wrap up. Hence the woolly hat on my head. So I'm on the board of Women in Mining UK, and that's a case there where we see massive changes with regards to where you've got the compositions in terms of leadership within different organizations, be it driven by quotas, which is such a crude tool to try and get diversity into an organization. And of course, again, we know that diversity is by no means just gender. It is far more varied than all of that. But things have changed, kind of dramatically over the last few years, but we're not there yet. And one of those key areas that I think perhaps we're still struggling with in terms of getting there, we've seen improvements, but we're not quite there yet, are with some of the big conferences. So, for example, in terms of the number of different types of speaker, for example, who are given that platform, yes, whilst we are seeing some of the conferences being able to go 50-50 in terms of men, women, and other genders, for example, being kind of included in there as well. There are many conferences where that's still not the case, and we're only sitting at perhaps 20% people not looking exactly the same or coming from similar backgrounds. And often that's blamed on the people who are paying for those slots to speak. But I think from an action perspective, as somebody who also runs lots of conferences, it's actually down to the conference organizer. You have the power to stipulate exactly who gets those slots and who is able to stand up there and speak. And it's also a case of when there are those opportunities for people to stand up and say something, those diversity panels, I'd love to see a diversity panel that was all just white men, to be honest. Speaking about, I'm fed up of seeing diversity panels where that's the only diverse piece in the conference, because actually we've all got lots of other things to say about the sector and things to share as well. So in terms of tangible actions, yes, we have seen lots of improvement coming through, and there's some fantastic reports that are out there that outline all of this. But in terms of really tangible action, if you're organizing a conference, actually you're the one with the power to change things and make sure that you've got a really awesome, diverse group of speakers who you may need to nurture. So it's not just a case of inviting someone to speak. You may need to offer them some training, some sort of support so that they feel comfortable standing up in front of people, in front of be their colleagues, be it in front of strangers, and actually saying what's on their mind. So you may need to give them some coaching as well. But that's how we create improvement and change within not just geosciences, but within every sector as well.
Yeah, and I mean, that's particularly relevant with this being an event hosted by the SEG, who does have an annual conference, and so hopefully some of the organizers are listening. Lara, Neil, anything you'd like to add in terms of that sort of actions that we're seeing either from companies or other societies or sort of other groups you're involved with personally?
Yeah, I might touch on something Sarah said in her first response around positive changes she's seeing, and what we're seeing in the industry is people being held accountable, really putting that spotlight on when someone is inappropriately behaving, or there's misconduct happening in a company, an organization or a team. We're seeing more of that getting addressed, more of that being highlighted, and there are code of conduct documents that are being refreshed and highlighted and plastered as in a way that's really accessible. I think those code of conducts used to hide in the HR library of documents, and it was sometimes hard to really find those resources. Like, what do you do if you need to reach out? Who do you talk to, and what are those steps? And those are being showcased at the front end of companies' pages. You see it in some of the conferences; they have their code of conduct right up at the front, or they're displayed. And with that, it's giving that empowerment to groups and individuals to be able to address when misconduct happens. Where it can improve, I think is a great step, and we're seeing more of it happen because it's critical. It's important. I know, as an early career geologist, I've had people make comments, about my appearance that I felt really were unwanted. My very first year at a conference, I was a second year student, 20 years old, really young. Walked into my networking event, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, super excited to get into this industry, and heard so many great things about it. Was networking and getting to know and trying to absorb as much information. And I had it was an evening networking event, and this individual just grabbed my bottom unwantedly, and I was just shocked. I was like, I never thought in a professional setting this would happen and this would occur, and I didn't know who to talk to, didn't know what to say, didn't know how to address it. And that's probably a very stark reality to maybe nowadays, where I think someone would call that out, or I would definitely have said something in that occurrence. And so it's a positive to see that that's starting to happen, and individuals are starting to feel empowered to speak up, and there's bystanders and allies that may help and support if that were to occur. Where we might improve is I think really with organizations and companies is being more maybe transparent in their efforts. And the film, Neil highlighted this, data speaks volumes. We can get confident in the data and I think sharing, what really are companies doing to address, and keeping individuals accountable, and providing regular updates and progress on their actions, that they're you talk the talk, walk the walk, and making sure that people are making companies accountable and maintaining that kind of safe and respectful workplaces that we all want to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, I suspect that if we were having this conversation, there'd be quite a few of us who unfortunately have similar experiences as you've had in public spaces. And so, Neil, I'd like to go to you and leverage off that discussion you raised around being an active bystander, being an ally. Lara mentioned code of conducts and things. Do we think that's enough? Where do you think we can go from this place that we're at?
It's interesting. At the end of the last panel discussion on this film, and there was talk about bystander training and intervention, and within tech and in exploration, we certainly rolled out a series of formal bystander intervention trainings within our exploration group. I think a big part of it was, and Susan Lomas, who runs the course, she shows all just the experiences that she's had in her life, right? And then when you scale that upward into something like the Rio Tinto report on, on the culture, workplace culture over there, right? You realize that there's a lot of statistics, and each one of those individual statistics is a completely unique situation. And I think within the sort of discussions that we have, and I'm also part of we have an inclusion and diversity committee at Exploration in Tech, is trying to understand what are these actions that we can bring forward. And one of the things I've seen happening in the last couple of years is, we've gone away from just talking when we have our safety shares at the beginning of a workday or in the middle of a week. It becomes more of a value share as well, and cultural share, and to broaden the horizon of what it's not just physical safety, it's mental safety, it's personal safety. How comfortable do you feel within the working group that you're in? And just understanding what values that you could have. I think the concept I read somewhere a couple of months ago about someone, who would be called, quote unquote, a brilliant jerk, someone who is really good at what they do in the workplace, but they're just not great with all their colleagues, and understanding that it's the individual versus the team aspect of it, and how important that is. We've seen a lot of this in the industry, and I think, again, coming back to the film, it appears that in universities which have a completely old structure and which is set up in such a way that a lot of these institutions have been around for 100 years, is so hard to change. And how in industry, that change is happening and it's being motivated. But I think in the university and the academic fields, it's not so much. You don't have bystander training or dialogue training with incoming professors. I think a lot of it is understanding how to give feedback. And there's so much of understanding how to just give constructive feedback from the perspective of a manager and an employee and a colleague can be interpreted as harassment. And understanding how to give your message, just how you deliver your message, is just as important. And so it highlights to me and then within the societies itself, and understanding in conferences and valuing the safety of their attendees, and everybody's coming together in this nexus where you have a lot of different companies, a lot of different universities. There things become less clear, and I think it's due to conference organizers to have a clear statement at the beginning and end of every session or event, stating this is what is acceptable behavior and this is what is not. And if you do have a problem, this is who you can talk to. And I think in the company that I work for, yes, we definitely have it. It's become a lot clearer as who we can go and talk to about these sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that raises a really interesting point. We've discussed a bit around the actions that companies are taking, but would any of you like to speak to the resources that companies are providing to give support to people who may have experienced this kind of harassment or behavior, and what you think has worked from your perspective? Maybe Lara, we start with you.
Sure. In terms of probably support, I think we're seeing more groups, companies have specific programs like employee assistance programs. It allows for a whole range of counseling services or support groups that may be needed in terms of that kind of what Neil spoke to, like who you can talk to. It's another resource available. If you can't find someone that you can speak to that you trust in terms of a colleague or a mentor or a line leader or HR, there's just another group that you can reach out to get that type of support that is needed. Also, I think you can see there's confidential helplines or hotlines that are paid for by companies to allow anonymous reporting. It can be a very daunting and scary experience to maybe want to speak out at times. It may be a very difficult or challenging time. It may be your line leader, or it could be someone very close that you just don't have the opportunity to be able to address it with someone else other than maybe anonymously. So there are those programs, I think, in place. I think what what can be improved upon, or maybe some advantages to adding to, the suite of programs or resources is, more specific type of counseling. When harassment occurs, it's very trauma related. It's a very it affects your physical, mental, emotional well-being. And I know that in order to move forward or heal from that type of experience, having the resources who maybe are experts in that, and knowing that that's available to people, I think would really provide that sense of trust, sense of feeling really supported by the company you work for, knowing that there is that available to you.
Yes, Sarah, anything to add on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot more is now available to people, and I get to work with all kinds of different organizations, again, not just mining companies, but all kinds of different industries. And so therefore, as one of those external consultants and also my team, something that we often get asked to feedback on is, how does our company differ to everyone else? Because South 32, Tech, BHP, fantastic organizations, but you get quite sort of trapped in, okay, what's going on in my world? And I get to work with all three of you. So I can, without letting any secrets out of the bag, actually say, well, actually, these are areas where, actually, in terms of the conversations that are going on, you're really strong, but other people are doing something that looks a bit like this. So you kind of get that cross-pollination. And then also as well, so something that I think we're learning from, say, the banking sector. So back in 2008, when, I don't know, there was a slight wobble with regards to world's finance, etc. So yes, of course, everything came unstuck with regards to the global financial crisis back in 2008, 2009. And one of the things that the regulators said back then was, you guys need to go and create a risk culture. And by what they meant by risk culture was actually that sense of accountability, transparency, and trust throughout the organization. So you could say, okay, we need to be able to take risks, but up to a certain point. And then we need to be able to escalate things through the organization, but also acknowledge that there will be tensions between different objectives at different points in the organization. And that's something that within mining, the mining industry has managed to make risk management so complicated compared to other sectors. Like, trust me, it is within mining, we love to overcomplicate it. And so there's a little trick that lots of mining companies are beginning to use now, which is when you are doing your risk identification, and I don't just mean in your health and safety risk assessments, I mean when you're looking at the assessments across the project, is to say, okay, we've got all this stuff that we know about, but what about the things that we know about that we're not sharing? I.e. the elephants in the room. Some companies call them gorillas. Some companies call them grey rhinos or ostriches. In Senegal, they refer to them as being big fish. I don't know why. I think that's because my French wasn't good enough at that point in time, but we'll go on from that. But when you start asking people, what do you think the elephants are with regards to this project or this bit of the operation? That's where you begin to get what's really going on behind the scenes or kind of within that team. And a lot of it is, as soon as people start sharing it, it's amazing what comes out. And it's not just with regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's about all kinds of other stuff. And so within mining, a trick is to take risk management to the next level, which is where it should be. It's not just that tick box. Yes, I've done a risk assessment, so therefore I've covered my behind so that if something goes wrong, it's okay, I'm safe because I filled in the Excel spreadsheet or the software. Actually, it's a case of we've acknowledged where there are these areas of uncertainty and perhaps misinterpretation between us. Let's talk about them. Let's escalate them through the organization and get leadership to actually listen to what's going on here. And that totally shifts the culture. So you see that beginning to happen, and it happens in other sectors the whole time. That's a really neat way of doing it, because we also have to do it for regulatory reasons as well. So we may as well use it for things like diversity. Thanks, Libby.
Yeah, Neil, how would, I think there's that's a really interesting perspective on it. And Sarah also raised the very good point that quite a few of us here are speaking from the perspective of big companies. How would you see that kind of thing transferring into the society, and as the society goes into a new era, and with the discussions around conferences and things, where do you think the society sits with this?
Talk about tough responses to follow. In terms of broader society, I mean, when you're talking about cultural views about where people are coming from, and I think if you just think about the association test, the Harvard implicit association test that was run there, right? Whether you associate male with career, female with family, right? And that change now is obviously very, very hard to combat. And I'll come at this response now mainly from what we view as appropriate roles in society, and maybe it's understanding that it's simply times have changed, and that maybe a focus within a society will be towards like providing an event, for example, who knows, maybe for networking just for women or people of color or something like that, just so they can discuss their own experiences, to bring people together and to submit those ideas to the various societies. And in other ways, right, is besides it, at least again from a company perspective, putting money where our mouths are, is to actually fund those sorts of initiatives at the grassroots levels in the societies, where if you say like, hey, this is a university, or this is, we're trying to make this change, and we see, like, for example, there's a gap here, like for example, there's women or people of color not wanting to come into economic geologies, to create that space by saying, hey, you know, this is a field where we identified where there's a gap, or that we're not getting people as much and many people as we should from this particular part of society, and to give those special attention. I think that's that's a way to approach it. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, that was quite a challenging follow-on. What I'd love now is to dive a little bit deeper, and Neil and a couple of people have touched on this. There is the key message in the film is definitely the challenges of harassment around being a minority scientist. I'd be fascinated to get your perspectives on the more unconscious bias, subtler components of this, and the kind of impacts those can have as well on people staying in a particular field. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think the kind of the self-realization as well is that every single one of us is biased in some way, you know, and the first step there is to acknowledge where we are biased, because then we can go and seek to kind of expand our own understanding, etc. And I think, I mean, that's the case, and it's kind of weird and wonderful, sort of how and where we are biased. It's almost like how we've been programmed, you know, just what sort of experiences we've had, you know, as we go through life. You know, you change your mind about stuff the whole time. And so I think that being aware that we ourselves have that unconscious bias is important, because that then does reflect through how we interact with other people. I think the other thing as well is that when somebody comes to you and they say, okay, look, I've experienced this event, or I'm worried about that, it comes back to what, in a way, what Lara was saying. It's really important to try and get the data and get the facts, because often you need to be that ally to then help escalate it or help do something about it. And that's something there where when you're trying to instigate some sort of change, it's very easy to become quite emotional about what you've heard. And the problem is that emotion doesn't necessarily instigate the right sort of change, because emotion tends to give birth to more emotion. Whereas if you can take this down to, well, hang on, what are the facts? And we're all scientists, so we're quite, we should be quite good at this. What are the facts? But also, what are the areas that I don't know about? So let's actually take into account those areas as well. And there's a great book that I got given a long time ago called Fierce Conversations by Susan Scott, which, okay, it's a horrible title in a way for the book, but the kind of real takeaway there is when you are going to go in and have a difficult conversation, so maybe it's because you're escalating something where somebody has experienced harassment, you're helping them, kind of escalate this through an organization, you have to have the facts, go in with the data, and don't make things up. It's so easy to accidentally make things up or invent what you think maybe happened in that situation, because it needs to be the truth that comes through all of that. So I realize I'm still in solution mode, Libby, maybe rather than answering your question. But I think these are things here when somebody is experiencing harassment, sometimes we have our own unconscious bias with regards to how we interpret it as well. And so that needs to be acknowledged before we then go and say, right, what are the facts and how do we maybe go and deal with this situation?
Yeah, Neil, your thoughts on that?
Keep on having to follow such awesome Sarah responses. But I think, it's context is everything, and understanding from a personal level, like you are the product of your own individual experiences, right? So here's an example I remember from my undergraduate days, and coming it now, I am an immigrant. I immigrated to Canada, and for the beginning of university, and I feel like a lot of like immigrants and people who are non-traditional members of what makes up economic geology just feel like they don't have the tools that a lot of folks who come into this society to begin with. Like, for example, like I had a colleague at university who came to a field school with just sandals on, and we had a postdoc who was there. It's like, well, are you even a geologist, right? And just questioning what he was worth and where he came from. And then all it needed was like the professors on the course to provide a list of like what it is you need, right? And not letting people assume what they need to do to get in. Like, it's just, we can provide some notes, and it's contingent on us to provide those sort of frameworks for people coming in new to the society to work with. And I think, again, coming back to my comment about feedback, right? And just like trying to understand how to put yourself into to be objective when talking about what the change that you want to have, and to have concrete, not to also just to come into situations like I'm feeling this, right? But not to offer a solution is also, you come in, yes, that emotion is good, but you also have to think about, well, how can I can actually manifest this change, right? And communication between members of the team, of your workplace, of your social circle, to let people know that this is what's going on. I think that's, and transparency, as I think both Lara and Sarah have talked about, that's all these things that come down to a lot of communication.
Yeah, Lara, would you like to?
Yeah, I might continue on that train of thought of, I think those unconscious biases, and they can be quite subtle, or can be involuntary. You may not be completely aware of it, but they can be the little spark. They can be that spark that can culminate in a workplace or within a team. And it's like Sarah said, it's really key to get the facts, to address it, and give, and to Neil's comment, give that feedback, constructive feedback, to address it early on, because at times they can really build up, and if it left unchecked, it can really create a toxic environment where people start to not bring their best selves to the team, where they can start to shut down, where they can start to feel isolated, and not be able to be members of the group or members of the team, and not bring their whole selves. And that's what we want to achieve, right? That's the whole purpose of this, is we want to be and bring our best selves to every day, and to the workplace, and to society, right?
Yeah, 100%. So I've got one more question for the panel, but what I'd actually like to do as well is encourage the attendees to please use the Q&A box. We have kept some time to answer questions from the audience. So while we sort of go through one more discussion, please do put your questions in. What I'd like to end off with, and it was starting to come out a little bit, is what advice you would have for our attendees today, people to take back out into our society and our industry, of actions, things to do, things to think about when you're navigating this, you know, and maybe you're seeing something and wondering about being an active bystander. Yeah, what's the sort of key advice you'd like our attendees to take away from this? Neil, would you like to start us off?
Sure. And number one is that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes, and and obviously receiving the feedback when you receive, to be told that you have made a mistake is to get better, and that we're all getting better. And like, you know, I couldn't echo more what Lara was talking about, is if you're feeling like you can't be your authentic and original self, and you feel like you have to be like someone else, then it's probably not a good sign that things are not going right. I think in terms of being an ally, I think always trust your gut. If you see something that you think is wrong, you have to, it's probably because it is, and that you should always reach out to the person that you feel is being harassed and say, how do you feel and how can I help you? Because you have to be as objective as possible, but you always have to think about what's your immediate response. And then, you know, to be able to provide a safe space for people to trust, and to understand when people are telling you what they're going through, it's because they're living through an experience. I think, so it all comes down to like empathy, emotional intelligence, introspection, mindfulness. And when you talk about individuation, I talk about not individuality, I talk about individuation. It's like understanding everybody has that experience, and that you should not be it should not be viewed as what group that they're coming from. It doesn't mean, so what I mean to say is, it's like, do not assume someone who is female does not have certain traits of what you think all females represent. They are that person. And so it's just like understanding where people are coming from.
Yeah, Lara, do you want to follow on from that?
And Neil had a great summary of exactly the advice and really what we could do to empower and just keep that momentum of awareness. Maybe one thing I can add is maybe more a kind of a positive action, you know, speaking up. And we talked about, you know, constructive feedback and addressing and highlighting when things or misconduct occur, or subtle or unconscious bias. But when something does happen and there are those wins, celebrate it, you know, call those out, you know, bring that to the table, celebrate diversity. You know, Neil spoke of some ways in which, you know, he's done, you know, in his organization, ways to celebrate diversity in different committees, but it could be as simple as having, celebrating International Women's Day in your group, or celebrating a country or someone's diverse background, and bringing a potluck or food to celebrate that culture, and you know, acknowledging that, because positivity can be infectious. You know, people can gravitate to that as well, and so, you know, highlighting those and empowering others can continue to create that welcomeness and supportive, you know, environment you want to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah?
Yeah, just building on that, I think that the key is actually curiosity. And this is something here where even if you see someone doing something that's totally shocking, actually kind of saying, okay, that's really interesting. Why is that just happened? Because if you go to somebody and you say, you're a terrible person, how dare you do something like that, then their hackles are immediately going to go up. And you get that defensive mechanism that's very natural in all human beings. Whereas instead of that, kind of going, well, oh, that's really interesting the way you said that. Can you kind of give me some more information about that? I'm really interested to understand, but doing it in a way that's not condescending. So again, of course, culturally, depending on where you are, there are different ways of doing that. And I've got an example of that. So I was running some sessions. Actually, again, it was for a bank in Nigeria, and one of the exercises in the session was the group had to. I had asked them to split into teams, and they were in their teams, and they were identifying all of the biggest risks for human beings on Earth. Okay, so they were all in their teams, and it was in the feedback session. And I said, great, okay, what does everybody think? And the only way to keep control of this group was to have them all standing up with their phones on their tables face down, because otherwise they were just constantly on their social media. So that was a case where they were all standing up, big circle around the room. There were about 30 people there. And a very imposing gentleman who was standing directly opposite me in the room, he goes, I'll tell you what the biggest risk is to human beings on Earth. And I was like, great, all this energy, that's fantastic. And I said, what is it? He goes, I tell you. And I was like, yes, tell us, what's the biggest risk? And he says, gay people. And I thought, wow. I mean, what do you do with that? And the thing there was, so the real me was sort of floating somewhere behind me going, oh, what do I do with this situation here? But the professional me went, that's really interesting. Why do you say that? Tell me more about why that's your opinion. And so we started having a conversation, and to be honest, it got worse before it got better, because the women either side of him started dancing and saying, yes, we agree. But in Nigeria, it's illegal. So, you know, this is something here where it's a case of, from that context, in that society, this is something that we actually need to respect what people's opinions are. And so once you kind of get to those root underlying things that are driving it, then saying, okay, I've been curious, as uncomfortable as it is, I'm understanding it. Okay, now let's build up in terms of where do we perhaps need to go with this particular situation. And that's something that's so important, because if we work with companies, I mean, we work in a discipline that takes us all over the world to all kinds of different cultural situations. And we're all programmed in our own ways, but it's a case there of being curious with regards to what somebody else brings to the table, as shocking as it can be, is instead of immediately being, no, that's wrong, actually understanding what's driving all of that first, because then you can build up and say, okay, what do we maybe do with this situation? So I think that's number one, is being curious. The second thing is, I helped to facilitate a panel a couple of years ago, actually just after the film came out. And there was one individual on the panel who's brilliant, very autistic. And so we did a lot of work together before the panel to make them feel comfortable in terms of speaking in public, etc. But that was something there as well, where it was a case where the piece of advice that she gave to everyone was, ask me about it, and I'll tell you how you can behave that will make me feel better and easier so I can interact with you. Don't hide the fact, don't go, oh, I think she's a bit strange. Actually, ask me about what it's like to be autistic, and I'll tell you what will make my life easier. And I thought, you know what? It's the same for me. As far as I'm aware, I'm not autistic or anything like that, but actually there are things that other people can do to make my life easier as well. So I think that's a case of, we're all unique, we all live in our own context, and actually asking one another to say, what could you be doing that will make my life easier and me happier? There's that two-way reciprocal relationship there as well, which I think can be really nice. Thanks, Libby.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to raise, and it actually segues quite nicely into a question we've received from the audience, from Pim van Geffen, who would be interested to know your views on the topic in light of Desmond Tutu's statement, which is, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And
so I think, yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Pim. I think you've put that very eloquently. Yeah, I think, again, that's curiosity. So again, going back to that experience in Nigeria, well, because, so they said something that for me was incredibly shocking, and was a very wrong thing to say. But hang on a second, in society, etc., there's something much deeper that's going on there. And so therefore we need to understand all of those sort of causal factors in a way that are feeding into this. And to be honest, celebrate the diversity of thought in a way, as well, as uncomfortable as that is. But we don't grow unless we're made to be uncomfortable to a certain degree. I'm not condoning what anybody said in that particular situation, by the way. But yeah, I totally agree. And I think the key is curiosity.
Lara, your thoughts?
Oh, I can't think of saying it any better than what Sarah said on curiosity. I think that's the root of really trying to even just find out what that maybe those biases are, and really addressing what those maybe precursors could be, before they maybe escalate to something where, just like in that analogy, something that evolves and gets much worse. So yeah, curiosity, I can't agree more on that.
Excellent. And any final comment, Neil?
I mean, I think it also understanding where, if your allies are in the company, that you can bring that conversation towards. And I'll put it in the context. I've spent a couple of months working at a mine in South America, and I visited a part of the solvent extraction electrowinning facility, and I had a gentleman chatting with me, and like he noticed that I was wearing an earring, and then he basically said, like, why are you wearing that? And then he said, only like a derogatory word for homosexuals would wear that, and women wear those, right? And I just was like sat back in shock. And the old me, I think at that time, it's just like would have just gone like, oh, why are you saying that, and stuff like that. And I think I was still in shock at the time. But then I came back out of it. I basically walked myself out of that situation and was able to go to my manager at the time, who had created that safe space environment. And this comes to installing leadership and management in place who believes in these sorts of things, right? You need those people to also be there to support you. And then go to my manager at the time. I was like, listen, I understand where this person is coming from, because they're just got a certain perspective in life, but like maybe he doesn't understand that that's not acceptable in the greater society, or at least not the society that I come from, right? And maybe you can communicate with his manager to let him know that this is, without instilling a direct one-to-one conflict, right? Is to, yes, if you're creating the right workplace and organization, you have that ability to escalate, to move laterally, and to come back down. And then basically it was relayed to me afterwards, so that feedback was given to them, and that they understood it, and then that they understood where I was coming from, that. And that was like a situation which I felt, maybe you have to manage upwards. So sometimes you have to take ownership of that situation and manage upwards to say, this is not correct, I'm observing this. And then you hope that the rest of the organization comes along with you for that ride.
I think that's a fantastic message to end off on. I want to thank our panelists, Lara, Sarah, and Neil, for sharing their insights today. This is always a topic that generates a lot of discussion, and as was mentioned, people can be afraid of being wrong, but having that curiosity and that engagement, and knowing what channels are available to you to address things, and when the right place is. I wanted to end off, you all answered a poll at the beginning. It would be super interesting to see actually what the diversity is of the group that's been listening in today. So if we can get the results of the poll just popped up as a way of closing off. So there we go. We have 2/3 of the audience today would describe themselves as male, and 1/3 of the audience as female. The next if we can get the next result.
Is it not showing them?
I'm not seeing them, but
There you go. I got it.
there we go. And interestingly, everybody dialing in from North America, which may be a function of the time zone that we're in. And the third one. And happily a really good career spread. So thank you everybody for that. That's really fantastic. And hopefully everybody took something out of this experience. And then finally to know how many people had so a significant a number of people, this was the first time they'd attended the panel discussion. So again, thank you for participating and acknowledging that this is an important conversation in our in the Society of Economic Geologists and our broader a broader industry. I would be remiss in my duties as host if I didn't end off with a few key messages related to the SEG. There are quite a few upcoming events. There is a SEG student chapter Earth Day Symposium and a webinar on copper as the red metal for a green future, as well as a repeat of a fantastic course, Drill, Deal, or Drop, exploration decision making through commodity and project cycles. That's a really fascinating one for anybody wanting to learn more about the financial motivation and decision making within exploration. And then finally, we have the SEG 2023 conference that will be taking place at the end of August in London, resourcing the green transition. You can find out information about all of these events at the SEG website with the note at the bottom. And thank you everybody to attending, and in particular to all of our members, and especially to our panelists who've given up their time and shared openly and honestly on the conversation today. So thank you again.